You are listening to a free full audiobook version of Tabbies and Turpitude, a Port Blanchet historical cozy, the Ruby Hobbs Mysteries Book 1. This audiobook has been uploaded to YouTube by the author. An ebook edition is available at most ebook retailers. This is part 2 of 2 parts.
Tabbies and Turpitude, a Ruby Hobbs historical cozy mystery by Celia Kinsey. Chapter 9. Ruby left more confused about Hazel Potts' state of mind than when she'd arrived. Before Ruby took her leave of Opal, she asked if anyone had informed Hazel that Dave McGee was dead. "It's funny you should ask that," Opal replied. "Dr. Wrigley and I debated about it and decided against telling Miss Potts about Mr. McGee. We thought it might upset her too much, seeing how—" Opal trailed off before Ruby interjected that it had been Floyd's opinion that Hazel and Dave had been carrying on some semblance of a romance. Well, they might have had a romance at one time, but when Mr. McGee came to see Hazel while she was still delirious, he seemed to be regretful about breaking up with her. "What made you think that?" "He was terribly upset, poor man." "Oh?" "Yes, he kept saying that if only he'd known, he wouldn't have asked for so much because now he was left with nothing." "What did he mean by that?" "I took it to mean that he'd proposed marriage to Miss Potts, but she'd refused him, and then he'd broken off the love affair because he couldn't stand the humiliation of being rejected." "Did Mr. McGee say anything else?" "He kept shaking Hazel and demanding that she wake up." "And of course she didn't." "No." "Now that Hazel is awake," Ruby told her sister, "she seems to be relishing the whole affair. One wonders how she'll react when she finds out that Dave is dead." Ruby wondered that too. She wondered a lot of things about Hazel. If Miss Potts were truly terrified that someone was trying to kill her, wouldn't she be going to the police or at least cowering in fear? Instead, Miss Potts seemed almost gleeful, like a malevolent child who has gotten away with a misdeed and pinned the blame on some defenseless peer. There was nothing for it except to carry on nosing around, and there was no better place to start than confirming that Mrs. Minot and Mayor Prill really were having an affair, as unlikely a pairing as that seemed. To that end, Ruby was sitting out on Alma Finch's porch at 7 that evening, a tall glass of lemonade in one hand, and both eyes trained on the Prill house across the street. It was the ideal location for spying. Alma's overgrown azalea bushes grew up to the level of the railing, and her equally overgrown wisteria vine hung down like a curtain. Ruby could see out, but anyone on the other side of the street would have the gravest difficulty seeing in. Alma's incessant chatter might have given away their presence, but despite Alma's propensity to talk, she had a high-pitched, reedy voice that didn't carry. Ruby kept her own replies to occasional polite nods. That was all that was necessary because Alma had been going on for 40 minutes about her grandson, Earl, who was almost certainly going to become a surgeon. Ruby had met Earl, and the boy possessed roughly the volume of brains that would fit into a couple of teaspoons and even less common sense. But Ruby restrained herself from telling Alma so. Ruby had been at Alma's since 6:30 because she was loath to miss the departure of Mrs. Prill off to her bowling league. But so far, the woman had not come out the front door. Unfortunately, the Prills kept their sedan parked in a little garage off the alley in the back. The alley had one exit visible to the street and one that came out on the other side of the block. It was impossible to know if Mrs. Prill had left the other way without checking if the car was missing from the garage. Ruby would find that out later by peering into a little window in the side of the Prills' garage. In the meantime, she wanted to see Catherine Minot going into the Prill house with her own eyes. Ruby's patience was rewarded when she spotted Mrs. Minot coming down the street at 7:15. That morning at the butcher's, Catherine had been impeccably dressed, complete with a starched madres shirt dress, a double crinoline, high-heeled pumps, and matching pink patent leather accessories. This evening, Mrs. Minot, who lived just a block away, was far more casually attired in a gray jersey cotton sweatshirt and supremely unflattering matching jersey cotton baggy trousers. Ruby decided this was a ruse on Catherine's part. Mr. Minot was hardly likely to suspect his wife of going out to meet a paramour wearing clothing she wouldn't deign to be seen pruning her roses in. Before opening the side gate, Catherine paused and scanned the street, obviously wanting to be sure no one was watching. Then she slipped through the gate, around the side of the house, and out of view. Earl has very steady hands, Alma was saying. They say steady hands are the hallmark of a great surgeon. I'm sorry, Alma, Ruby said, but I just remembered I must get home and feed my cats. You and your cats, said Alma. Don't you think you spoil them a little too much? Ruby was well aware that the prevailing opinion in the community was that she put rather too much store by her cats. Ruby was so well known to be a cat lover that every few months she'd find that some down-and-out soul had dumped their poor unfortunate feline at her gate in the hopes that she'd take it in. Most of the time Ruby found homes for these abandoned cats, but sometimes she couldn't resist adding to her menagerie. Poe and Chaucer had been two abandoned strays that she'd added to her already two-cat household of Dickens and Bronte during the difficult period after Orville had passed on. Ruby knew that people laughed at her attachment to her cats, but she had long ago decided if one was going to have a vice, being overly solicitous of feline welfare was better than many of the less savory ways humankind contrived to let off steam. Without her cats, she might be reduced to getting liquored up and making obscene telephone calls like Nicholas Hadley. I best be heading home, Ruby told Alma. But instead of heading home, Ruby drove around the block and parked at the other end of the alley that accessed the Prills' garage. Ruby got out, walked down the alley, and had just located an old apple crate so she could hoist herself up on it to get a peek through the cobwebby window at the side of the garage when she heard the hum of an engine. She glanced over her shoulder to see the Prills' robin's egg blue Cadillac creeping down the alley. Ruby hastily abandoned her attempt to clumsily clamber up onto the crate. Instead, she crouched next to it and called into the bushes flanking the alley. Here, kitty, kitty, kitty. She kept up this posture, even though it made the rheumatism in her left knee flare up, until she heard the car roll to a stop behind her. The engine switched off. Then there was the crunch of footfall on gravel. What are you doing, Mrs. Hobbs? Ruby had expected a feminine voice. After all, it was supposed to be Mrs. Prill who'd taken the car out to go to her bowling league. However, when Ruby straightened up, Mr. Prill stood before her, complete with a bowling bag. He wore a garish green shirt with the name Julius ostentatiously embroidered over the left breast pocket. There's a kitten in the bushes, Ruby said. I'm trying to coax it out. Mayor Prill didn't question her story. I haven't seen it, he said, but I'll tell Mrs. Prill to keep an eye out for it. Thank you, said Ruby. I see you've been bowling. Yes, I like to stay in shape. Julius Prill patted his ample belly and laughed. I hear your wife enjoys bowling, too. Do you bowl in the same league? Ruby well knew there were separate leagues for the gentlemen and the ladies, but one of the many advantages of getting up in years was that one could feign ignorance on almost any aspect of modern life with impunity. No, we don't bowl together. My wife gave up bowling recently. Oh, what a shame. Yes, her wrists started giving her trouble, Mayor Prill said. Now she plays bridge. Is Mrs. Prill at home? Ruby asked. Since I don't think I'm going to coax this kitten out, I might as well look in and say hello. Mrs. Prill is not receiving visitors this evening, the mayor said with cold formality. Ruby could only interpret this abrupt change in demeanor as panic that she not come in and discover Catherine Minot on the premises. Ruby drove home in a daze. Everything she had seen that evening pointed to the veracity of Alma's insistence that Julius Prill and Catherine Minot were on a left-handed honeymoon. But even if they were, that still didn't mean they'd resort to bumping off Hazel Potts just to keep her quiet about it. Besides, Hazel hadn't kept quiet about it. She'd told Alma Finch, the biggest big mouth in Port Blanchet Township. Sunday morning, Ruby slipped into her usual pew beside George and the twins. As usual, she had an excellent vantage point to observe the Minot family. Unlike her own juvenile flesh and blood, who fidgeted and gawked at the ceiling all during the reading, the offertory, and the invocation, the Minot little ones were the pictures of model deportment. Of course, the Minot young ones were not bereft of their mother, a role Ruby feared no one else could fill. Nevertheless, such complete composure and stillness on the part of all 7 of the little Minots begged the question of just what they'd been threatened with if they failed to behave like little angels. No child was that angelic, no matter how good-hearted and eager to please. For the first time since she'd noted the Minot offspring's conspicuous lack of childish restiveness, it occurred to Ruby that being one of Catherine Minot's offspring might be its own little Hades on earth. That Reverend Murphy happened to be speaking on that very subject, just as the phrase Hades on earth popped into Ruby's head, was too great a coincidence to ignore. Reverend Murphy was not one of those fire and brimstone preachers. Instead, his homilies generally consisted of exhortations to the saints to cultivate qualities of character which would befit them for an eternity spent in the heavenly realms. Reverend Murphy rarely acknowledged the possibility that any of his congregation might end up elsewhere in the afterlife. This Sunday morning, however, it seemed something had alerted the good Reverend that unrighteousness was festering in the hearts of at least a few of his flock, and he was waxing eloquent about wolves in sheep's clothing. About the time he'd moved on from the proverbial wolf to the proverbial lion, going about seeking whom he may devour, Ruby decided that Reverend Murphy had gotten wind of some troubling transgression amongst his congregants. She couldn't shake the feeling that the Reverend's sermon was being preached as a warning to some particular person, or perhaps several persons sitting in the pews. It could be that Reverend Murphy had been shaken by the killing of Dave McGee, but to Ruby's knowledge the murdered man had not so much as darkened the door of Reverend Murphy's church or any other house of worship in the community. Also, Dave McGee was still a stranger to most folks in Port Blanchet, and everyone Ruby had come across had expressed the opinion that Dave had been shot by an outsider. Surely no one in their little community would have any reason to kill Mr. McGee. No one really knew the man. Ruby couldn't help speculating that the Reverend's distress had nothing to do with a murder in their midst. It seemed more likely that Alma Finch had done such a good job disseminating the rumor about Mayor Prill and Catherine Minot that it had reached as far as the vicarage. Since Ruby could not see Catherine Minot's face, she craned her head around to look at Julius Prill, sitting 3 rows back on the aisle next to his wife. If Reverend Murphy's sermon had been intended largely for the mayor's benefit, it was a dismal failure. Julius Prill had nodded off. His chin had sunk down to his chest, and his mouth was hanging ajar. As Ruby stared, Mrs. Prill finally observed that her husband had dozed off and prodded him in the ribs with her elbow. Julius Prill awoke with a start and glanced around sheepishly to see if anyone had noticed him napping. Mayor Prill sat up straight in his pew and smoothed his tie. He finally gave the Reverend his full attention just as the man of the cloth was finishing up his sermon with the warning that not everyone who says, "Lord, Lord," shall enter the kingdom of heaven, and the bit about the sheep and the goats being separated at the pearly gates. If Julius Prill had any qualms about his fitness for the heavenly realms and the possibility that he might instead be destined for an eternity spent wailing and gnashing his teeth, he didn't appear to be losing any sleep over it. Chapter 10. After the service, George brought the twins over for Sunday dinner at Ruby's house. "What did you think of Reverend Murphy's sermon?" Ruby asked her son as she ladled out another dollop of mashed potatoes onto Ferris's plate. "It seemed to me that he was worried that someone in his congregation is up to no good," George said. "I thought so too, and I'm inclined to think it has little to do with Dave McGee getting shot." "To tell you the truth," George said, "I can't blame Reverend Murphy for fretting that Port Blanchet may be in the midst of a moral decline." "Oh? There have been developments since you discovered that money in the library van." George rarely volunteered information about anything related to his position as chief of police. Ruby suspected that her son had reached a dead end in his investigation, and although too proud to ask for his mother's advice outright, he was taking the roundabout route. "What kind of developments?" Ruby asked. "Has the rest of the money turned up?" "Unfortunately, no. How much do you know about the case?" "Just what was printed in the papers." "Then you know the physical description of the robber?" George asked. "A short, portly, red-haired man with a generally unkempt appearance, wearing a dark pinstripe suit." "And a mustache," George added. "I recall it was described as an old-fashioned handlebar. Did anything you read mention that the teller thought the man was wearing a wig?" "One article did mention that," Ruby told George. "Well, yesterday afternoon, Miles Cox discovered a red wig and a false red mustache shoved into the rain barrel behind the butcher shop." This was sensational news, but not so sensational that Ruby forgot about the pecan pie on the kitchen counter. Everyone had cleaned their plates, save the small pile of peas Franny had left behind. Ruby was inclined to turn a blind eye to the forsaken peas. "Take all the plates into the kitchen and set them in the sink," she told Ferris and Franny. "Franny, you bring in the pie from the counter. Be sure and use both hands. And Ferris, fetch a saucer and a small fork for each of us from the sideboard." While the children were occupied, Ruby asked George if there was further evidence to suggest that the bookmobile had been used as the getaway car for the bank robbery over in Saginaw, or if there was still a possibility it had simply been used as a place to stash the contraband cash. "So far," George said, "no one has come forward with anything. Surely someone saw it if the bookmobile was driven all the way from Port Blanchet to Saginaw and back in broad daylight." "If that van was used in the robbery," Ruby said, "it would have been easy to steal. The spare key hangs on a hook behind the circulation desk, and it could go missing for days without anyone noticing, never mind for a few hours." Ruby decided that Floyd's admission that his personal key had been misplaced for far longer than a few hours was not her story to tell. Besides, it would have been child's play to take the key to the van off the hook behind the circulation desk. It was highly likely that the robber, or possibly his accomplice, had stolen Floyd's key from him. There would simply have been no need to go to such lengths. "There's another thing," George said. "I hadn't put two and two together until I read the statements from the witnesses, but that bank guard was from Port Blanchet. He'd only been on the job for a few days when the holdup happened." "The one who happened to be out taking a smoke break?" "That's the one. It turns out it was Nicholas Hadley." "That boy you arrested for making obscene telephone calls?" "I intended to at least charge him with a misdemeanor, but Hazel Potts convinced me to drop the charges." "I thought Nicholas impersonated Hazel in some of the calls." "He did." "That seems very unlike Miss Potts." "I thought so too," said George. "Still, I guess there's good in everybody every once in a while." "Have you questioned Nick?" Ruby asked. "I would, but I can't find him. According to the only relative I could track down, Nick told them he was hitching a ride down to Florida and hasn't been heard from since." "Do you suppose Nicholas was connected to the robbery?" "I suppose it's possible," said George, "but it's equally possible he was simply neglecting his duty. Any bank manager with the sense God gave a turnip should have known a young man like him couldn't be trusted with such responsibility." "Who was the bank manager?" "Fergus Fitzpatrick. His father owns a 50% share in the bank, and Fergus is old Mr. Fitzpatrick's only heir. It seems highly unlikely that a man in a position like his would conspire to steal from his own father and risk the reputation of an institution he will eventually inherit." Ruby agreed that it seemed highly unlikely. "What about the teller?" "Roberta Bailey. She's a Saginaw girl. She has been working at the bank ever since she turned 18, and she just turned 28. Never been in any trouble. I talked to her myself, but she didn't have anything to add you wouldn't learn by reading in the papers." "Is it true that the robber didn't say a word?" "It is. I saw the note myself." "What did it say?" "Empty the till and the vault or else," or words to that effect. "What did the handwriting look like?" "It was rough, childish printing in pencil on a bit of lined paper, but I wouldn't put much stock in that," George said. "I could have concocted something similar by printing with my left hand." Franny had brought in the pie without dropping it, and Ferris had managed to get the saucers out of the sideboard without breaking anything. Chaucer and Poe were lurking underfoot, hoping for crumbs to drop. This was not false hope. Chaucer had already gotten hold of half a buttermilk biscuit Franny had lost control of, and Ruby had been pretending not to notice Ferris slipping Poe bits of skin off his fried chicken. "Nobody's found that rumpled pinstripe suit yet?" Ruby asked George, just as the phone in the hall began to ring. "Shouldn't you get that?" George asked his mother. "That's not for me," Ruby said. "That's the Sprackling's ring." "So it is," George said. "Back to your question. The suit hasn't turned up." For a few minutes everyone was quiet as they set to work demolishing their slices of pie, but a vigorous knocking on the back door summarily shattered the stillness. When Ruby went out to the kitchen, Joe stood on the back step, still dressed in his Sunday go-to-meeting suit. "Sorry to bother your Sunday dinner," he said, "but I need to speak to Chief Hobbs." "Was that an official call for you a while ago?" Ruby asked. "Yes. Joe said. I guess there was a new girl on the switchboard, and she didn't know the chief is always here on Sunday afternoons. They called me instead when they couldn't reach the chief. Hello, Joe, George said as he came up behind Ruby. Are you looking for me? I'm afraid so, Joe said. Miss Potts is dead. Dead? Ruby said. She seemed nearly recovered when I visited her yesterday. She must have really taken a turn for the worse. You could say that, Joe said. What do you mean? George asked. She doesn't appear to have died of natural causes. Chapter 11. I'll get my hat and head down to the station with you, George told Joe. The twins can stay with Mother until I get back. What did Hazel die of? Ruby asked while George was off collecting his hat. She was shot, Joe said, right through the heart. As soon as George had gone off in the squad car with Joe in the passenger seat, Ruby had shooed Franny and Ferris off to change out of their Sunday best into the play suits she kept on hand for just such occasions. Then she told them to run along next door and play with the sprackling youngsters. As soon as the twins were out back taking turns with the sprackling children at swinging from the old tire anchored by a rope from a high limb in the sprackling's oak tree, Ruby asked the new girl at the switchboard to put her through to Opal. Have you heard about Hazel? Ruby asked her sister without preamble. What about Hazel? Joe just came and got George. Hazel Potts is dead. I don't believe it, Opal said. I checked on her between leaving the church and going home for lunch, and she was right as rain. In fact, she was such a picture of health that Dr. Wrigley sent her home. I know she went because I helped her carry her suitcase down the stairs. Hazel didn't just keel over, Ruby said. According to the call Joe got, Hazel was shot. Shot? Right through the heart. I don't believe it, Opal said. Why would anybody shoot Hazel Potts? Ruby said she imagined that was a question a lot of people had. Who found her? Opal asked. Where did it happen? I don't know who found Hazel, Ruby admitted. And I don't know where she was when she was shot, but I fully intend to find out. 2 hours later, when a much-sobered Joe returned home, he told Ruby that it had been Sylvester who'd found his aunt lying in a pool of blood in one of the vacant rooms in the boarding house. Joe said the poor boy had been hysterical, not that anyone could blame him. Nobody was in the house when Hazel got shot? Ruby asked. No one but the shooter, Joe said. Sylvester didn't want to admit to it, but it came out that he had skipped church and was just getting home at 1 from rehearsing with the Gold Nuggets most of the morning. Where were they rehearsing? Ruby asked. In the Thompsons' basement. We confirmed that Sylvester was with his bandmates the entire time from 10 o'clock on. Miss Potts left Dr. Wrigley's at 1:15 noon. She must have been shot nearly as soon as she entered the house. Do you suppose someone was lying in wait for her? It would seem so. And it may be the same killer who shot Dave McGee. That's a logical conclusion, Joe said. It was a logical assumption to make, but Ruby couldn't help but wonder if it was a little too logical. Did it appear there was a struggle? Ruby asked. That's the odd thing, Joe said. It did seem like Miss Potts put up a fight. There was a chair knocked over in Fred Wiley's room, and a lamp was broken. It also appeared that the room had been ransacked, besides things having been knocked over in a struggle. Is it possible that Miss Potts surprised a burglar? It's possible. But what would Fred Wiley have that anyone would come looking for? I don't know. There was cash inside a briefcase that was sitting out in plain sight and wasn't touched. To say the entire room was ransacked is putting it a little strong, Joe said. It appeared that someone had gone through Fred's dresser. A bureau drawer was pulled out and the contents were dumped on the floor. There was also a large bottle of aftershave, which got smashed and created quite a stench. It does sound as if someone was searching for something. Floyd said something about Fred recently acquiring a mysterious backer for Sylvester's debut. Joe said Fred hadn't volunteered that information, but then no one had asked Mr. Wiley where he'd gotten that amount of cash, and the existence of this mysterious backer might explain it. You've talked to Fred Wiley? Yes, he arrived at the rooming house shortly after Sylvester did. He wasn't at band practice with Sylvester? Ruby asked. Evidently he was, but he left a few minutes earlier than Sylvester. If Fred ought to have arrived before Sylvester, why wasn't he the one who found Miss Potts? Fred told the chief he had car trouble on the way back from the Thompsons. That's why he got there a few minutes later than Sylvester. How did Sylvester get home? Rudy Thompson brought him and a couple of the other fellows from the Gold Nuggets home in the family's car, Joe said. The rooming house is right in town. Someone must have heard shots fired. So far, no one has said so, Joe told Ruby. Of course, that could be because the shooter was using a silencer. We're working on the assumption that whoever shot Dave McGee also used one. Floyd Vaughn slept right through Dave being shot in the alley and didn't find his body until hours after the fact. Any upstanding citizen might own a firearm for legitimate purposes ranging from hunting to target shooting, but only a hardened criminal type would feel the need to possess a silencer. That makes it sound like some kind of gangster shot Hazel, Ruby said, and Dave. Normally, Joe was reticent to tell Ruby too much. Undoubtedly, Sergeant Sprackling had been warned by his chief not to indulge Ruby's impulses to meddle in police affairs, but shaken as he was, his guard was down. Maybe she was shot by a gangster, Joe said. Maybe so was Dave. How in the world would Hazel have gotten involved in organized crime? Joe admitted that it did seem far-fetched. That night, Ruby could not fall asleep. She went to bed right after the end of the Colgate comedy hour. But despite the soothing snore of Poe, who lay by her head, she couldn't settle. Finally, she was so restless that she got up, shuffled downstairs in her robe and slippers, and heated herself a glass of warm milk with a tablespoon of honey and a pinch of cinnamon. She sat down at the kitchen table with her mug of milk, a piece of paper, and a pencil, and mulled over the question plaguing her. Why would anyone shoot Miss Hazel Potts right through the heart? Who hates Hazel? Ruby wrote the words in bold block letters at the top of the page and underlined them twice for emphasis. She then wrote down the numbers 1, 2, and 3. After number 1, she wrote Sylvester Potts. Sylvester went first on the list, but not because Ruby was convinced the boy was capable of killing his aunt in cold blood, even if he had been the one to discover her body. That made him an automatic suspect, even if he'd had no other motive. However, would Sylvester have the connections to procure a gun and a silencer to shoot his aunt? Would he take such an extreme measure simply because she was withholding his allowance? Ruby thought not, but considering that Sylvester had claimed to have been seeing the apparition of his aunt standing over his bed, he was either making up the story or suffering a mental breakdown. A person in the throes of a mental breakdown might be liable to do just about anything. However, Hazel's manner of death seemed more the act of cold calculation than the act of a nephew who'd recently taken leave of his sanity. Cold calculation fit Catherine Minot to a T, so she earned the number 2 ranking on Ruby's list. Unfortunately, as far as Ruby knew, Mrs. Minot's only possible motive was to keep Hazel from continuing to spread the rumor that Catherine and Mayor Prill were carrying on an affair. However, based on Reverend Murphy's admonitions to his flock to turn aside your feet from evil, it seemed likely that the horse was already out of the stable as far as Hazel's gossip campaign was concerned. Still, revenge is a potent motive. It could not be denied that either Catherine Minot or Julius Prill might be enraged at being made the subject of slanderous gossip, or gossip anyway. Based on Ruby's observation, the rumor appeared to be true. Ruby wrote down Julius Prill after number 3, then chewed her pencil for a moment before adding Fred Wiley as her 4th suspect. The only possible motive for Mr. Wiley to murder Hazel that Ruby could come up with was that Miss Potts was interfering with Fred's plans to propel Sylvester to fame and fortune. But now that Fred had found a financial backer, it seemed there was no real obstacle in his way. Fred had simply to convince Sylvester to go to Nashville with him. Fred's story about having car trouble on the way back from the Thompson house was believable enough, but without verifying it to be true, something which would likely prove difficult, Ruby was unwilling to dismiss the possibility that Mr. Wiley might have arrived before Sylvester. It was conceivable that Fred and Hazel might have quarreled about Fred's plans for the boy. It was possible that Mr. Wiley might have shot Hazel out of frustration with her continued opposition to his plans to make Sylvester and the Gold Nuggets into rock and roll stars. But it seemed to Ruby that rashness had played no part in Hazel's death. With Miss Potts' murder coming so closely on the heels of Dave McGee being killed in a similar manner, it seemed nearly inevitable that they had been murdered by the same person. Unless Hazel had simply surprised a burglar who was ransacking Fred's room for reasons unknown, whoever had murdered Hazel had almost certainly arrived at the rooming house with the intent of killing her. And, as Ruby had noted before, there were a few upstanding citizens who habitually carried a weapon on their persons for various reasons, but only the overtly homicidal or professional killers would be carrying a firearm with a silencer attached. Reluctantly, Ruby added number 5 to the list: professional assassin. The very idea that Hazel Potts might have a contract on her head was patently absurd, but so was the whole affair. Hazel had gone around claiming she had a dark premonition that she was about to die. In short order, she was so badly injured by a freak accident that she was reduced to a state of hysterical delirium. Then, just when Hazel had largely recovered from her brush with death, she was shot by an unknown assailant. Unless, of course, Hazel had made up the whole threat to her welfare and her subsequent misfortune at the paper drive. Chapter 12. Ruby couldn't shake the feeling that there had been something fishy about Hazel's accident at the paper drive, although how any fakery on Hazel's part might have contributed to her own death was a mystery. Ruby was so eager to confirm her suspicion that she was tempted to telephone Dr. Wrigley on the spot and claim to be in the grip of some grave affliction that required immediate attention. But then Ruby remembered Reverend Murphy's admonition to turn one's foot away from doing evil, and her better inclinations prevailed. In the morning, she'd visit Dr. Wrigley to see if he could look at her left knee. She had been meaning to get some more liniment at the drugstore, but Dr. Wrigley kept a stock on hand at his office. She could also consult him about the dizzy spells she'd been having recently. She expected Dr. Wrigley would just inform her that her conditions were down to the fact she was no spring chicken, and to take care not to get up from sitting too quickly. That didn't matter. An introduction of the no spring chicken motif would be the perfect opening to discuss the recent demise of Miss Potts. Her list of suspects was as complete as it was likely to get, and the hot milk was taking effect. Ruby went back up to bed. In her absence, Poe had forsaken his customary spot on the upper left corner of her pillow and was now sprawled sumptuously across the whole thing. Monday, while Floyd drove them over the country roads, Ruby and Floyd discussed Miss Potts' untimely death. "I can't help wondering if the robbery of the bank and Miss Potts' death aren't connected somehow," Ruby told Floyd. Floyd agreed that he, too, felt uneasy about a link between Miss Potts and the robbery. "There is," Ruby told Floyd. "Far too much I don't know about Hazel Potts. Perhaps there was more to her than met the eye." Tuesday morning, Ruby was up with the sparrows. By 7, she'd had her breakfast, fed the cats their morning ration of kidneys, and was on the line with Minnie, asking to be put through to Dr. Wrigley. The phone rang 6 times before Minnie came back, asking if it was an emergency and that she could try putting Ruby's call through to the Hungry Hog Diner, where the doctor often went for breakfast. Ruby told Minnie it was not an emergency. Ruby decided now was the perfect opportunity to ask Minnie the question that had been nagging at her ever since Floyd had told her that the reason Sylvester hadn't been in the gymnasium when the pile of waste paper had fallen over on Hazel Potts was that he'd been out behind the bleachers on the ball field necking. "Is Sylvester Potts going steady with anyone?" Ruby asked. There was a long pause before Minnie said, "Why do you ask?" "Well, I was curious, and some people are wondering if Sylvester might have had something to do with his aunt getting crushed with that pile of waste paper." "I fail to see how those two things are related," Minnie said. Her tone was uncharacteristically icy. Ruby had initially thought to question Minnie because she was only a year or two older than Sylvester, but Minnie's reaction had Ruby wondering if the question might not be personal. "Are you going steady with Sylvester Potts?" Ruby said. "I only ask because he might be implicated in that accident at the paper drive, and now that Miss Potts has been shot, and Sylvester had the misfortune of being the one to find her body." "Sylvester wouldn't hurt a fly," Minnie insisted. "I'm sure you're right, but if someone could vouch for Sylvester's whereabouts when that stack of waste paper fell on Miss Potts, it might take some suspicion off him now that he's also the one who discovered his aunt's body." "Fine," Minnie sighed heavily on the other end of the line. I was with him at the paper drive. We were out on the ball field. We didn't even know anything had happened to Miss Potts until hours later. Would you be willing to tell the police that, should they need to know? I would, said Minnie, but I'd rather not. Why not? My parents don't like Sylvester. He seems like a nice boy. He is a nice boy, but they don't want me going steady with a dropout. Didn't you? Yes, I did. I dropped out when Daddy got fired and Mama got sick. I went to work at 15, but they say boys should finish school. Ruby bit her tongue to prevent herself from asking if this sort of attitude was what the suffragettes chained themselves to lampposts for. Instead, she asked, Did Sylvester ever say anything about Dave? Mr. McGee? Yes. He didn't like him. Why not? Sylvester thinks Dave was a bad influence on his aunt. What do you mean? I don't know what Sylvester meant by that, said Minnie. It was just something he mentioned in passing a couple of times. Well, one thing is certain, it couldn't have been Mr. McGee who killed Miss Potts. No, it couldn't. What about Mr. Fred Wiley? What does Sylvester think of him? Sylvester thinks he's terrific, said Minnie, but I don't trust him. Why not? He's promising Sylvester the moon. What do you mean? He claims to have found someone willing to put $5,000 into making Sylvester the next Elvis. 5,000? At first, Mr. Wiley claimed it was $10,000, but apparently the backer started feeling less generous than he was. Then, just yesterday, he's claiming it's back up to $10,000 and possibly as much as $30,000. Who has that kind of money? I think Mr. Wiley's pulling Sylvester's leg. He can't even keep his stories straight, but Sylvester can't see it. Someone who just robbed a bank would have that kind of money, but Ruby didn't voice that fact out loud. Now, Sylvester says he feels too bad about going off to Nashville while his aunt isn't even in the ground yet, Minnie continued, but Mr. Wiley is pressuring him to leave tomorrow. Tomorrow? I have to go, said Minnie. There's a call coming in. A day and time for Hazel's funeral service hadn't even been set yet. It was no wonder that Sylvester was balking at skipping town. Surely whatever plans Fred Wiley had for the boy could wait. Ruby found Dr. Wrigley sitting at his usual booth in the back corner of the Hungry Hog diner, smoking a cigarette as he read the sports section over the remains of his bacon and eggs. Good morning, Mrs. Hobbs, the good doctor said, rising to his feet when Ruby approached his booth. What can I do for you? Ruby had intended to tactfully tiptoe around the subject of Hazel Potts by first bringing up her own aches and pains, but as she surveyed the doctor's haggard face, she changed her mind. She could go down to the drugstore and get herself a jar of liniment and leave her aches and pains out of the conversation. May I sit down? Ruby asked. Certainly. As soon as Ruby had slid with some difficulty into the hard plastic bench seat, she came straight to the point. You know how I often used to assist my Oliver in investigations? Dr. Wrigley and Ruby's late husband had been good friends. There had been many an evening when Oliver had been alive that the three of them had sat around the kitchen table and talked over the details of a difficult case. Now Ruby barely saw Horace Wrigley. As she sat across the booth from him, it struck her how much she had missed him. Is this about Hazel Potts? Dr. Wrigley asked. He also seemed to see little merit in beating around the bush. It is. There are several things about her death that trouble me. Such as? When I came to visit Miss Potts, I couldn't help noticing a rather unusual number of incisions on her arm, Ruby said. She said something about her IV needle kept coming loose. Before he spoke, Horace looked around to see if anyone was listening. Hazel was pulling her IV out, in her state of delirium. When we first brought her back to my house, she was tossing and moaning, but... He broke off as Hetty Finch, who worked the breakfast shift before heading off to her first period class at 8:30, stopped by the table to top up Dr. Wrigley's coffee and inquire if Ruby would be wanting anything. Ruby asked for a coffee, and Hetty went off in search of another cup. Opal said something to the effect she believed Miss Potts was exaggerating her condition, Ruby told Horace, and I'm sure she was. Are you telling me she was fully aware she was pulling out her IV every time? I am, the doctor said. But why? That I can't tell you, said Dr. Wrigley. At first, I was convinced that she was enjoying being the center of attention and milking her accident for all it was worth, but then Sylvester came to me claiming that he'd seen her standing over his bed. You think it was Hazel in the flesh Sylvester saw, not an apparition? I'm sure of it. The revelation of how Horace Wrigley was so sure that Hazel had been faking her delirium had to wait while Hetty sat down a heavy mug in front of Ruby and filled it to the brim. One night I followed her, Dr. Wrigley said as soon as Hetty was headed back to the counter. You followed Hazel. When Opal left for the evening, Horace told Ruby, I made sure that Miss Potts could overhear me telling Opal that I was also going to be out for a while. I went out the front door, which I closed with a bang. Afterward, I snuck back inside and hid in the closet at the foot of the stairs. It wasn't long before I saw Miss Potts up and about. She left your house? Yes, I followed her all the way back to the rooming house. Why would Hazel want to scare Sylvester like that? Asked Ruby. Hazel Potts was a mean-spirited woman. I got the impression that she believed Sylvester made her life a misery. Perhaps she was eager to return the favor. Perhaps. Have you any idea why someone would have wanted to kill Miss Potts? Ruby asked. There are many disagreeable people in this world, and very few end up shot through the heart. I confess I haven't a clue, Dr. Wrigley told her. She was shot only once and soundlessly. It seemed someone wanted her dead, but it doesn't appear to be a crime of passion. Ruby resisted the uncharitable impulse to point out that Hazel Potts was not a likely candidate to inspire passion in anyone, although, to hear Floyd tell it, she had had a man in her life not long ago. Opal tells me that Dave McGee came to visit Hazel while she was bedridden. Opal told me about it, but I wasn't there at the time. I understand that Dave seemed upset about something. Opal had taken Dave's words to be the result of Hazel rejecting his proposal of marriage. Ruby, being in possession of additional knowledge about Dave and Hazel's tempestuous relationship, wasn't so sure her sister had read the situation correctly. Do you think it's possible that Hazel might have snuck out and shot Dave? Ruby asked. Can you account for her whereabouts during the early hours of last Monday? The doctor admitted that he could not. Opal had left at 9 to sleep in her own bed. The doctor, suspecting as he did that Hazel was putting them all on, but believing her play-acting to be harmless, had neglected to check on her during the night. If Hazel did kill Dave, did some third-party shoot her in retaliation, Ruby said. Dave McGee didn't strike me as a man who would inspire loyalty of that caliber. I don't think so either, but we can't rule out the possibility. I suppose not. Returning to the matter of Hazel's death, Ruby said, it's perplexing that there appeared to have been a struggle in Fred Wiley's room. I saw the state of that room when I was called to make out the death certificate. Although there were no other significant injuries to Hazel besides the gunshot wound, her clothing and hair were in considerable disarray. Judging by the state of that room and the condition of her person, it looks as if Hazel Potts fought for her life. There's no question about Miss Potts's cause of death. The doctor shook his head. She died quickly of a single shot at short range. Chapter 13. Ruby might have quizzed the doctor further, but just as Hetty was coming around to top up their coffee, Catherine Minot and Mrs. Prill came into the cafe arm in arm. They were giggling like a couple of schoolgirls. Ruby had never seen Catherine Minot so relaxed. With a smile on her face and her head thrown back, and her carefully coiffured blonde curls slightly out of place, the woman looked almost human. It was time, Ruby decided, to take the proverbial bull by the horns. She'd likely never be presented with a better opportunity to eliminate Catherine Minot and Mayor Prill once and for all from her list of suspects. There's someone I must talk to, Ruby told Horace, who rose to his feet, placed a dime on the table as a tip for Hetty, and went to the counter to pay his bill. Ruby walked resolutely toward the booth in the opposite corner of the cafe, where Catherine Minot and Mrs. Prill were twittering away in low voices like a couple of parakeets. At the last minute, Ruby changed course and inelegantly wedged herself into the booth directly behind Mrs. Minot. I'm going to celebrate, Ruby heard Catherine say. I am too, Mrs. Prill warbled just loud enough for Ruby to hear. I'm going to order a full stack of pancakes with strawberry sauce and extra whipped cream. The two, although they were clearly not keen on the other patrons hearing the content of their conversation, didn't seem to have even registered that Ruby had slipped into the booth next to them. "You are wicked," Catherine said. "I've been subsisting on celery sticks and dry toast for a month at least." "I am wicked," Mrs. Prill said, "but after all the plain oatmeal and grapefruit, what would our husbands say?" "I doubt mine would notice if I gained it all back," Mrs. Prill answered. "I don't think he has any idea I've lost 15 pounds. "But I thought buying that Mr. Stauffer's magic couch was your husband's idea," Catherine said. For a few seconds, Ruby was sure she'd misheard. What in tarnation was a Mr. Stauffer's magic couch? Then Ruby recalled seeing an item in a women's magazine a year or two back extolling the virtues of a vibrating divan of that moniker. The outlandish device was guaranteed to melt the pounds away. At the time, Ruby had said pish-posh to the notion that one might undulate one's pounds into oblivion while lounging on a sofa and watching television, but apparently Mrs. Minot and Mrs. Prill had done just that. "I thought Julius might take advantage of that couch himself," Mrs. Prill said a bit petulantly. "But no, the only time there are two people on that contraption is Friday nights when you come over and watch the Perry Como show with me while Julius is out bowling." It suddenly all made sense. Ruby remembered seeing Catherine Minot skulking into the back door of the Prills wearing that supremely unflattering gray cotton jersey sweat set. Mrs. Minot hadn't been furtively visiting the Prills to seduce Mayor Prill. She just didn't want to be seen making social calls in such clothing. And Catherine Minot hadn't been expecting. She'd just put on a few pounds and then taken to drastic calorie restrictions to get those pounds back off again. That was why she'd fainted at the paper drive. This also explained why Mrs. Minot was clutching at her stomach at the butcher shop. She'd outgrown her girdle. There was nothing, Ruby had discovered from sad experience, more uncomfortable than trying to contain oneself inside a girdle one had outgrown. The only truth in the story Hazel had bandied about was that a couch had been involved. However, it hadn't been a sordid scene with Catherine and Julius canoodling together on the divan. It had been an entirely innocent Catherine and Mrs. Prill, commiserating on their expanding waistlines and attempting to vibrate away their excess adipose tissue while watching the Perry Como show. Why had Hazel Potts spread the rumor that Catherine Minot and Julius Prill were getting up to no good with each other? Perhaps Miss Potts had sensed that Mrs. Minot viewed her with contempt and had impulsively decided to enact revenge by making Mrs. Minot into an adulteress. Hazel must have sensed that Catherine would be loath to dispel the rumor if she had to admit she'd been forced to take drastic measures to maintain her figure. Whatever the case, the gossip was just that. Seeing Catherine Minot and Mrs. Prill in the booth together, giggling away, it seemed inconceivable that either of them or their husbands would have resorted to murdering Hazel Potts in revenge for some rumor. Had they been concerned about their reputations, they might have dispelled the rumors just by setting a few key gossips in the community straight on the matter, albeit at a cost to their pride. Conceivably, Catherine Minot had caught wind of the gossip and found it so patently absurd that she'd refused to dignify the rumor with a denial. The idea of Mrs. Minot and Mayor Prill falling suddenly and deeply into illicit love was patently absurd when one stopped to think about it. Ruby felt a bit of a fool herself for having half believed the rumor. She decided, on the spot, to conclusively eliminate the entire Minot and Prill households from her list of suspects in the murder of Hazel Potts. However, there was one person whom Ruby could not in good conscience eliminate without further investigation. That person, much as it pained her to admit, was Hazel's nephew, Sylvester. After Ruby exited the Hungry Hog Diner, Ruby left her car where she'd parked it in front of the Five and Dime and walked the 3 blocks south to Hazel Potts' rooming house. Ruby stood on the front porch of the rooming house and hesitated before ringing the bell. She had determined to interrogate Sylvester, but now, faced with the callousness of such an action, she hesitated. She was still debating her next move when the door opened and the boy in question emerged. "Hello, Mrs. Hobbs," Sylvester said. He looked considerably better than the last time Ruby had seen him fleeing from Dr. Wrigley's. His eyes looked as if he'd been crying, but he appeared to have slept. His clothes were clean and his hair was neatly oiled and combed. "I'm very sorry to hear about your aunt," Ruby said. "Thank you." The boy looked genuinely sad. Ruby supposed that just because he and his aunt might not have seen eye to eye about his show business ambitions didn't mean Sylvester hadn't felt a degree of fondness for the woman. Sylvester stood there on the porch, shifting his weight from one foot to another, but he didn't take his leave. "Is Floyd around?" Ruby asked. "He'll be leaving for a job soon," said Sylvester. Floyd did odd jobs for a local carpenter when he wasn't driving the bookmobile or stocking shelves in the evenings at the Five and Dime. "Would it be all right for me to go in?" "Yes." Ruby made a move for the door before Sylvester stopped her. "Mrs. Hobbs?" "Yes." "There's something I wanted to talk to you about," Sylvester said. "Oh?" "We'd better go inside," said Sylvester. Ruby sat down at the scratched and rickety kitchen table where Hazel Potts had prepared meals for her boarders and waited for the nervous boy across from her to get his words out. "You used to help your husband with investigations," Sylvester finally said. "I did. Well, I think someone murdered my aunt." This was hardly a revelation. Hazel Potts had been shot through the heart. It couldn't have been anything but murder, but Ruby didn't belabor the point. Instead, she asked, "Do you have any idea who might have wanted your aunt dead?" Sylvester stared down at the tabletop and traced a particularly deep gouge with his fingertip before saying, "No, but I'm pretty sure I know why." "You do?" This was sensational news, but Ruby tried to remain calm. Unless Sylvester himself was the killer, a notion Ruby had already instinctively dismissed, then she might be about to close in on who had shot Hazel. "You know Mr. McGee," Sylvester said. "The late Dave McGee, who used to work at Eller's garage?" "Yes." "Floyd did mention once that he thought your aunt and Mr. McGee were sparking, but they fell out on bad terms." "They did," said Sylvester. "And you think that has something to do with why both he and your aunt were shot?" "No, there's another reason. I have to show you something." Chapter 14. Sylvester abruptly got up from the table and went into the room off the kitchen. Through the open door, Ruby watched as Sylvester dug into the bottom of a drawer of the dresser sitting next to the bed with a floral spread. On top of the dresser was a collection of hats and gloves and an old-fashioned celluloid brush and comb set. There was no question that the dresser Sylvester was looting belonged to his late aunt. He emerged from the room holding the last thing one might have expected to find in the dresser of a single middle-aged woman. Sylvester silently held up a rumpled pinstriped suit for Ruby's inspection. "This looks like the suit that was worn in that bank robbery over in Saginaw City," Ruby finally said. "Are you trying to tell me you believe your aunt was the robber?" "I am." "And Dave McGee was her accomplice?" "Yes." "And you believe Dave was killed for some reason connected with the robbery?" "I do." "And your aunt also?" Sylvester said he did. "Why?" Ruby asked Sylvester. It was one thing to suspect Hazel Potts of wearing that pinstripe suit, disguising herself in a red wig and a false mustache, and wordlessly demanding the teller empty the safe of Citizens Bank of Saginaw. It was quite another to suggest that both she and Dave McGee, if he really had been her accomplice, had been subsequently shot. "I don't know why either of them was shot," Sylvester said, spreading his hands helplessly over the pinstripe suit that lay between them on the kitchen table. "I just know it must have something to do with the robbery. But you have no evidence to prove it?" "I don't. I was hoping—" "That I could help?" Ruby said. "Yes." "Supposing it really was your aunt who held up that bank, what makes you think Dave was your aunt's accomplice?" "I heard them arguing a couple of times about money." "Couldn't they have been arguing about the rent?" asked Ruby. "I don't think so. They were talking about something in the future." "Money they didn't have yet?" "It seemed like it." "Besides the suit, do you have any other reason to believe that your aunt was the robber?" "I saw her." "You saw her robbing the bank?" "No, I saw her when she was supposed to be at Dr. Wrigley's." Ruby decided not to let on that this was something she already knew. "Where did you see her?" "Here," said Sylvester. 3 times I saw her here at the house at night." "While she was supposed to be in bed in a hysterical delirium? At first I thought I was seeing things. I thought I must be going crazy." You think your aunt was faking being semi-conscious? Ruby asked. But how would that protect her from suspicion if she had robbed the bank? The robbery happened before she was injured at the paper drive. I know it sounds crazy, Sylvester said. I don't really know what she was thinking. Your aunt had been going around telling people she'd come into some money from her great-grandfather, Ruby said. Do you know if that was true? I wrote to my father and asked him about that. I got a letter back a few days ago saying it was true. He and my aunt did have a Belgian great-grandfather who was some sort of baron or something. Both he and my aunt did get a small inheritance when some old castle or something was sold off recently and split about 200 ways between all the surviving heirs. How much was your aunt's share? My father said he got about $50. But I got the impression that your aunt was going around implying she had gotten large inheritance. I'm sure that isn't true. I believe the story just snowballed, said Sylvester. I think that's why she did it. Why she robbed the bank. She'd gone around saying she was suddenly rich, but she wasn't. She cared a lot about what people thought of her. She had one of those inferiority complexes. Ruby conceded that the danger of public humiliation might be a powerful motive for a woman like Hazel Potts, who was already sensitive to what people thought of her. But why, after holding up a bank, would Hazel almost immediately fake her injury at the paper drive? If she'd orchestrated her near-death experience just for attention, then why get up during the night and harass her nephew? Perhaps your aunt could have gotten out of bed and wandered around during the night for a couple of hours without anyone catching on. But why would she want to? Don't know, said Sylvester. Have you shown this suit to anyone else? Number I wouldn't like to have Aunt Hazel remembered that way unless it is the only way to bring her killer to justice, Ruby asked. Yes. Ruby left the boarding house without seeing Floyd and drove straight over to the library. If Sylvester was right, and both Dave and Hazel had been involved in the bank holdup, that also meant that whoever had killed them might have been after their ill-gotten gains. Hazel's killer might have gotten wind, possibly by holding a gun to someone's head, that there was supposed to be $20,000 stashed in the library bookmobile. If so, it was highly likely that they would be eager to recover the money and skip town before they were caught. Ruby went straight from the rooming house to the library and lured Martha, the head librarian, into the tiny office behind the circulation desk. As soon as they were safely behind closed doors, Ruby said, I suppose the police have been asking questions about the location of the bookmobile on the afternoon that bank robbery happened over at Saginaw City? Martha admitted that they had. Your son, the chief, seemed convinced that the bookmobile was used as the getaway car. He told me you found money hidden under the shelves. I did. Floyd told me that someone else had driven the bookmobile a considerable distance based on the level of fuel in the tank. I was there when he checked. I can explain that, said Martha, looking distinctly embarrassed. I allowed my daughter and son-in-law to use the van early in the morning on the Friday of the robbery. They had some furniture they wanted to move, and I thought, I understand, Ruby said. I'm not here to cast any blame. Well, that could be why the gas tank was low, Martha said. I probably shouldn't have loaned it to them, but I did. How many miles do you think they drove it? Martha pleaded ignorance. They made a few trips from their old house on First Street over to their new house over by the Armory. A few trips back and forth across town hardly seemed sufficient to drain the tank. I don't know what to think, said Martha. What about on Friday, the day of the bank robbery? Ruby asked. Can you say for certain that the bookmobile was sitting in the library parking lot the whole time? I can say with complete certainty that it wasn't, said Martha. Not long after my son-in-law brought it back, someone came over from Eller's to take it in for an oil change. Eller came and got it? No, it was Dave, his assistant. That's why I don't think it was used in the bank robbery, Martha said. It was over at Eller's garage getting the oil changed. Maybe the bookmobile had made it over to the garage eventually, but Ruby had a strong suspicion that Dave McGee had taken the very long way round of getting there, quite possibly past the Citizens Bank of Saginaw. Did you tell Chief Hobbs all this? I did. George had been keeping vital information from her. Ruby felt a flash of irritation welling up in her chest until she remembered that she, too, had been less than forthcoming with George. She'd not gone straight down to the station and reported that Sylvester had found that rumpled pinstripe suit amongst his aunt's possessions, and she had no intentions of doing so. Yet, anyway, Ruby was determined to examine Dave McGee's former lair in the back of Eller's garage. While she was there, she'd quiz Eller on what he knew about the man. Most importantly, she'd find out when or if the bookmobile had shown up at the garage for that oil change. She'd been meaning to stop by the garage anyway. Her old Buick had developed a troubling wheeze when required to go uphill. When Ruby arrived at Eller's garage, the door to the bay was up, and the Prill's shiny robin's egg blue Cadillac was up on the lift. All Ruby could see of the man under the car were his legs, but judging by the lack of grease and wrinkles on his coveralls, it had to be Eller under there. Eller might be coated in oil and grime by day's end, but it was a matter of professional pride to begin each day with a fresh set of coveralls. Ruby was quite sure that Eller's late assistant had felt no such compunction. "Eller," Ruby called out as she entered the garage. Eller withdrew his head from the recesses of where the Cadillac's engine should be and wasn't. "Morning, Mrs. Hobbs. What can I do for you?" "My car is laboring when it goes uphill. I press the pedal to the metal, but there's no get up and go." "Probably you just need a new air filter," Eller said. "I'll take a look at it. You were due for a new one, and I told Dave to change it last time you were in, but he may not have remembered." That was a charitable way of putting it. Unfortunately, it was much more likely that Dave simply hadn't bothered. "How are you getting along without Dave around?" Ruby asked. "About the same," said Eller. "He'd up and quit on me the night before he was shot, at any rate." "Quit? Good riddance is how I feel." "Were you about to fire him?" "He didn't give me a chance. No, about midnight I came back to the garage for something, and I caught him leaving with half the contents of my cash box." "He was stealing from you?" "Not exactly," Eller said. "I counted out what he'd taken, and it was exactly what I owed him in wages. He was quitting without notice. Skipping town, I guess. He had a bus ticket on him when I made him turn out his pockets to ensure that's all he took." "Bus ticket to where?" "Chicago." "Did he say why?" Ruby asked. "Nope. He'd only been in town 6 months, but I guess he already wanted to move on." "I heard a rumor that he and Miss Potts were an item." "Dave and Hazel Potts? I doubt it." Eller started laughing uncontrollably before abruptly sobering and adding, "God rest their souls." "So you think there's nothing in the rumor?" "I suppose there's something in the saying misery loves company, so I don't rightly know," Eller said. "Dave wasn't what you'd call chatty." "Do you recall Hazel ever coming to the garage while Dave was working?" Eller said he didn't. "I heard Dave moved out of Hazel's boarding house a couple of weeks ago. Had he been staying in the garage?" "He had," Eller said. "I didn't like him camping out in the back room, but Dave claimed that Miss Potts kicked him out, and he didn't have any other place to go." "Did Dave say why he got ejected from the boarding house?" "He was vague on that point, but he was angrier than I'd ever seen him. He was always moody, but whatever happened between him and Hazel Potts really riled him." "Would you mind if I looked around your back room?" Ruby asked. Floyd mentioned that Dave had borrowed his razor strop from him, and when he moved out, Dave took Floyd's strop with him. Maybe he left it behind and I can return it to him. The part about the razor strop was true, but that wasn't why Ruby was so eager to search the place where Dave had been laying his head in the weeks leading up to his death. "Knock yourself out," said Eller. "I'll go take a look-see at your air filter." "There was one more thing," Ruby said. "Just as a matter of curiosity, Martha tells me that Friday before last, Dave came by the library and took the bookmobile away for an oil change." "Did he?" Floyd must have asked him to. This Ruby very much doubted. Floyd would have remembered a thing like that and mentioned it during their multiple discussions about the likelihood that the library van had been used as a getaway car. "Did you see the bookmobile here that day?" "I didn't, but then I have a mind like a sieve. Normally I'd look through the tickets for that day, but we don't usually write one up when we work on the bookmobile. I regard it as a service to the community." Quite right you are," said Ruby. "The community appreciates it. The bookmobile is a very worthy cause. Now, if you don't mind, I think I'll have a look around for Floyd's razor strop." Eller's back room was neat and tidy. There was a wooden desk, a single straight-back chair, a file cabinet, and a canvas army surplus cot leaning against the wall. The place was swept bare, and even the trash can was empty. Chapter 15. After leaning down with difficulty, Ruby checked for anything that might have rolled under the desk by accident. She then took down the army cot from its resting place. After that, Ruby decided there was nothing to be gained by further examination of the room unless she was prepared to rifle through the contents of Eller's desk and file cabinet, which she was not. She had no qualms about Eller's uprightness. She certainly had no inkling that he might have been somehow tangled up in Hazel Potts of Dave McGee's untimely demises. "Well, Dave at least left the place clean," Ruby said to Eller, who was removing a blackened air filter from the old Century. "He did," Eller said grudgingly. "Even took out the trash." "What do you do with your trash?" she asked. "I have a burn barrel around back," Eller said. "You think Dave would have thrown Floyd's razor strop in there?" "It's worth a look." Ruby wasn't sure what she was looking for, but there was no harm in seeing what Dave might have wanted to leave behind, assuming it wasn't burned to ashes. Dave McGee was the personification of sloth. There had to be a reason he'd decided to empty Eller's office trash can other than an impulse for neatness, which he lacked, or a desire to be helpful to his former employer, which seemed equally unlikely. Ruby just hoped Dave's indolence had prevented him from lighting whatever he'd discarded on fire. Ruby found Eller's burn barrel out back of the garage without trouble. She was disappointed to see nothing but ashes. She stirred the contents around a bit with a stick and came across a clump of paper that hadn't burned all the way through. When she fished out the clump of paper, her perseverance was rewarded. Sandwiched between the discarded invoices for car parts and the paper wrapper off a sandwich from the Hungry Hog Diner were a handful of singed paper strips, each emblazoned with the words, "Citizens National Bank, Saginaw City." Whoever had thrown them into the burn barrel had lit them on fire, but, unfortunately for the guilty party, they hadn't bothered to make sure they'd been reduced to ashes. Ruby dropped the wad of paper back into the burn barrel and went inside, where she found that Eller was back under the Prills' car. "May I use your telephone?" she asked Eller. Back in Eller's office, Ruby asked Minnie to put her through to the police station. When George was on the line, Ruby told him, "There's evidence in Eller's burn barrel suggesting that someone on the premises was connected with that bank robbery over in Saginaw." "What evidence?" "Multiple bands from bundles of bills. Slightly singed." "I see," George said grimly. "I'll come over and have a look." "I take it you don't believe Eller was the one who threw those strips away?" Ruby said. "Do you?" "No." 20 minutes later, George and Eller had tipped the burn barrel over, and the contents were strewn on the ground. George carefully sifted through the contents, but found nothing more of interest other than the strips of paper which had undoubtedly once held together bundles of bills from the Citizens Bank. Eller said Dave had a bus ticket on him when he left the garage during the night shortly before he was shot, Ruby told George. "We did find an unused ticket in his pocket." "It does make sense that he wouldn't hang around town if he had all that cash from the bank robbery," Ruby said. "But where is that cash now?" "All we have is circumstantial evidence tying Dave to the robbery," said George. "Finding a few bits of burned paper isn't enough to reach a conclusion." "I made Dave turn out his pockets when I caught him taking his wages from the cash box," Eller said. "What about his bag?" Ruby asked. "Dave must have had some luggage with him." "He did," Eller said. "He had an old leather duffel bag, and I went through it. It was just clothes and things. All the money Dave had on him was a few dollars in change and the bills he took from the cash box to cover the wages I owed him." "Maybe he had the cash hidden elsewhere," Ruby suggested. "Possibly," George said. After that, George had gone off with the singed bank strips in an evidence bag. Eller refused to take payment for the new air filter he'd installed in Ruby's Century because it was Dave's fault it hadn't been replaced the last time Ruby had been into the garage. Ruby drove toward home in a daze before it occurred to her that since Dave had shown up at Hazel's rooming house before skipping town, he must have had a reason. Maybe he'd stashed the money there, or perhaps Miss Potts had. When Ruby banged on the door of the rooming house, Sylvester answered right away. "Is anyone else at home?" she asked before explaining she was there to search the place. "Mr. Wiley went out a few minutes ago," said Sylvester, "and all the other fellows are at work." "I'd like to look around," Ruby said as she stood in the hall. "I have a feeling either Dave or your aunt hid part of the money here, but that someone else is looking for it. If whoever else is mixed up in this hasn't already come back for the money, he will. Bolt the doors and don't let anyone in unless they are wearing a badge, not even if they live here. Before we search the house for the money, could I take another look at that suit you discovered in your aunt's things?" Sylvester dug the suit out of the back of Hazel's bureau drawer. Ruby checked the pockets, which were empty. Then she shook it out. As she did so, she caught a whiff of a familiar scent. She held the suit to her nose and took a deep sniff. "What did Mr. Wiley say when he went out?" Ruby asked. "Not much. He said he was going to get a shave and a haircut, and after that, he was going to go down to the library and read the latest issue of Hit Parade." "How did Mr. Wiley seem?" "Seem? Did he seem worried? Or angry, perhaps?" Sylvester said Mr. Wiley had seemed out of sorts, but that the man had not confided in Sylvester about what was troubling him. "He's in a hurry for us to take off for Nashville since he's found us a backer, but I keep telling him I'm not leaving until after Aunt Hazel's funeral." So Mr. Wiley went off to cheer himself up with a haircut and the latest issue of Hit Parade. Mr. Wiley made friends with one of the girls who works at the library, and she called this morning and told him that the latest issue was in. The library bookmobile. It came to Ruby in a flash. There was very likely money from the bank robbery concealed at the boarding house itself, at least whatever was left of the $20,000 that hadn't been spent by the various parties entangled in the whole affair. But that accounted for only half the takings. Someone had hidden the other $20,000 in the bookmobile. It was unlikely that besides the police, anyone but Ruby, Martha, and Floyd knew the police had recovered the currency and taken it away. She must get to that bookmobile, Ruby decided. She must prevent her prime suspect from recovering his ill-gotten gains from their place of concealment. Ruby had intended to stop at home just long enough to change out of her new shoes, which were pressing the bunion on her left foot in a painful manner. Unfortunately, disaster had struck in her absence. Ruby smelled the skunk as soon as she entered her front gate. The smell grew stronger around the kitchen door, and when she got into the kitchen itself, the stench was so strong she held her hanky against her nose as she struggled to throw up the sashes on every window on the first floor. At first, Ruby was afraid that the skunk had gotten in through the cat flap in the back door and sprayed the premises with its warning scent. But then she heard Poe yowling from the stairs and the pitiful meows of Chaucer from the hall. When Ruby leaned down to smell Poe, the stench was overpowering. Chaucer was even worse. It was clear they had both tangled with a skunk. Ruby went looking for the other two. Bronte had withdrawn sullenly under the side table in the sitting room, and Dickens was rolling back and forth on the middle of the rug, as if he could somehow rub the stench off himself and transfer it to the carpet's fibers. There was nothing for it but to run a tub full of hot soapy water and wash each cat while the house aired out. Cats, as a species, do not take to the water, and it was an hour later that Ruby had finished bathing the last cat over the vigorous protestations of all four. Dickens was the weakest of the four by virtue of his advanced age and naturally docile nature. He limited his protests to piteous outcries that would have made any observer believe Ruby was subjecting him to diabolical experiments involving surgical instruments. Bronte had been second into the bath and had yowled, growled, and ripped a piece out of the front of Ruby's favorite apron with the claws of her hind feet, before drawing blood on Ruby's arm with her front claws. Poe had bitten Ruby on the hand before clinging with all his might to the old window screen Ruby had placed in the bottom of the tub, because she'd heard somewhere that having something to latch onto made felines feel more secure when submerged in water. Chaucer did not bite, scratch, or yowl. Instead, he wriggled out of Ruby's grasp and escaped the tub, leaving a trail of soapy, skunk-scented water across the floor. He'd withdrawn underneath the old four-poster bed in the guest room downstairs, and it had taken all of Ruby's strength and some rather smart work with a broom to get him out. By the time all the cats were deskunked, Ruby was exhausted but not so tired that she'd forgotten about staking out the bookmobile. She put mercurochrome on her scratches, changed her dress, put on a pair of old shoes that had stretched to accommodate her bunion, and headed down to the library. She set up camp at a reading table by the window and pretended to peruse the paper. From this vantage point, she could keep an eye on the hook behind the circulation desk where the van key hung and the old library van outside. True to Sylvester's word, Fred Wiley sat in one of the chairs by the magazine rack, reading the latest issue of Hit Parade. He seemed more interested in watching Clara, the girl librarian at the circulation desk, than he did in the contents of his magazine. Chapter 16. Ruby soon noticed that the library patrons gave her table a wide berth, and when Alma Finch stopped by to inform her for the third time that her granddaughter, Hetty, was going to be homecoming queen, Alma didn't linger. "Do I smell of skunk?" Ruby asked Martha when the librarian passed by Ruby's table with a cart full of books to reshelve. "A trifle," said Martha, just as Ruby caught a glimpse of someone going around the back of the bookmobile. Ruby glanced over at the chair where Fred Wiley had been reading his hot-off-the-presses edition of Hit Parade. The magazine was back on the rack, and Fred was nowhere to be seen. "Please call the police station and ask them to send someone down as soon as possible," Ruby told Martha. "I'll be out by the bookmobile, keeping an eye on the suspect." "Suspect," Martha said, but Ruby was already halfway out the door. Even in her youth, Ruby had not been one of those sprightly, athletic females who went in for team sports or track and field. The toll her ordeal of bathing 4 skunk-scented felines had taken on her, combined with her still-throbbing bunion, meant it took her so long to get out to the bookmobile that the figure she'd seen through the window had already come and gone. Or that is what she initially feared. Then she noticed that the back door to the van was slightly ajar. Before Ruby had taken up her place at the reading table by the window, she'd made a circuit around the old van and checked the doors. They'd all been locked. Ruby crept up to one of the dirty back windows of the bookmobile. The window was covered with a thick layer of dust and grime, and Ruby had just rubbed a tiny peephole in it when she felt the cold barrel of a gun pressing into her side, and a man's voice said, "Get in the van." Then a plump hand with hairy knuckles reached around, opened one of the back doors, and shoved her in. The man hefted himself in behind her. "Get in the driver's seat," he said. "I don't know how to drive this thing," she protested. "Well, you'd better learn real quick like," the man behind her said as he shoved her forward toward the driver's seat. Ruby tried to remember what she'd seen Floyd do when he drove. Aside from the size of the vehicle, it couldn't be terribly different from operating her old Century. For the first time, Ruby turned just enough to get a good look at the man who still had the barrel of his pistol poking into her girdle. Fred's eye twitched and his free hand shook as he shoved the ignition key at Ruby. "Where are we going?" Ruby asked as she turned the key, but not so far as to make the engine turn over. "Just do what I tell you." "Well, you'd better tell me something then," Ruby said. She was oddly calm, considering that she had a gun pressed into her midsection. "Go out to the highway," Fred said. "I'll tell you where to turn." "It won't start." Ruby insisted until she heard the click of Fred releasing the safety on the gun, looked down, and realized the pistol was fitted with a silencer. Fred could shoot her right there in the parking lot, and no one would be the wiser until they found her bullet-riddled body. She discovered quite suddenly that the key would turn in the ignition. Ruby pressed her foot down gently toward the accelerator. Floyd, who generally occupied the driver's seat, was much taller than she. As a consequence, Ruby had to practically stand up to press down on either the brake, the clutch, or the accelerator with sufficient force to operate the vehicle. "I'll have to adjust the seat," Ruby said. "Otherwise, we'll never get out of the parking lot." Fred was hunkered down in the space between the driver's side and the passenger's seat, clearly loath to be seen, but he grudgingly moved back to allow Ruby to bend down and adjust the driver's seat. All the while she fiddled with the lever on the seat, Ruby listened for the sound of the siren on the squad car. Half of her wanted help to arrive, and half feared what desperate act Fred might do if threatened with arrest. If anyone were going to get shot, she'd rather it was her than George. It was just as Ruby finally got the driver's seat locked into place that she formed a plan. She'd lure Fred into making a run for it. If she could contrive to wreck the old van and render it undeniably out of commission in some location near town, She thought there was a good chance that Fred would simply flee on foot, leaving her and her girdle free from bullet holes. Hopefully. This old van is temperamental and shudders every time it shifts, Ruby told Fred. If you'd be so kind as to put that gun somewhere besides pointed directly at my person, you'll be much less likely to accidentally shoot your driver when she shifts gears. It's not for me to tell you what to do, but if you don't want to have to dump my body out on the sidewalk and take over driving before we even get out of town. Fred reluctantly lowered his gun and re-engaged the safety. Ruby made a great show of having difficulty driving, careening from one curb to the other, and alternately jabbing down on the accelerator and then slamming on the brakes until they were out to the highway. She looked back over her shoulder at Fred, who was looking quite green around the gills, and then she floored it as she yelled over her shoulder, "Where to?" "The old Howerton place," Fred said. Ruby wondered why Fred wanted to get to the old Howerton place, but then she remembered that the house had been vacant since Mr. Howerton had passed away in the early spring. There was very likely an operational vehicle still sitting there. Fred must plan to ditch the bookmobile in favor of a less noticeable conveyance. Ruby couldn't help wondering what he planned to do with her. The best-case scenario was him locking her in the root cellar while he made his getaway. "Do you have to drive so fast?" Fred demanded. Ruby did have to drive so fast if she was going to overshoot the next curve, skid off the highway, and get stuck in the mud on the edge of Reese's cow pond. But first she'd see if she could get Fred to confess. "Did you kill Hazel Potts?" she asked. "Why would I kill Miss Potts?" Fred said. Ruby was feeling oddly exhilarated. She should be terrified, but all she could think about was obtaining a confession out of Fred Wiley. "You caught Hazel planting evidence in your room that would tie you to the bank robbery, didn't you? She put that suit in your bureau drawer," Ruby told Fred. Ruby was convinced that in the aftermath of the struggle between Hazel and Fred over the suit, when the bottle of Fred's aftershave had been smashed on the rug, the suit had gotten soaked with the scent. She didn't reveal her line of reasoning to Fred, however. "I'm not telling you anything," Fred said. "You caught Hazel shooting Dave, or maybe you came upon Dave's body soon afterward and put two and two together. Dave wasn't happy with the cut Hazel gave him after he drove the getaway car, and he was threatening to blow the whole thing wide open," Ruby said. "Hazel couldn't risk that, so while she was supposed to be lying in bed unconscious at Dr. Wrigley's, she came back to the boarding house and shot Dave in the back. He probably didn't even see her coming. I have a feeling Hazel caused that stack of papers to fall on herself so that she'd have a watertight alibi when Dave ended up murdered." There was a stony silence from the back of the van. "You probably helped Hazel drag Dave's body into the alley." Fred didn't say a word. "Then you wanted Dave's cut for keeping quiet." Fred still remained silent. "But Hazel didn't want to share," said Ruby. "Hazel didn't want to share with you, just like she didn't want to share with Dave." "Look, lady," Fred said, but Ruby interrupted him. "So Hazel decided to pin the bank robbery on you, but when you caught her trying to plant evidence, you weren't having it. Look here, there was a struggle and she threatened to shoot you just like she shot Dave," Ruby said. "She was waving around that gun you now hold in your hand." "If you're right, which I'm not saying you are," Fred finally spoke, "didn't I just shoot her in self-defense?" "Possibly that's how a jury would see it," said Ruby, "or possibly not. Either way, Sylvester would refuse to have anything to do with his aunt's killer, and all your efforts to propel him to stardom would be in vain. Look, lady, I know you think you have things all figured out, but you don't know a thing. I didn't kill Miss Potts." "You threatened to kill me." "I'm not going to kill you," Fred insisted. "I just wanted to scare you a little. This thing isn't even loaded." Hopefully, Fred's insistence that the pistol he'd been waving around wasn't loaded was true, because they were nearing the curve at Reese's farm, and Ruby didn't want to end up shot if Fred's gun accidentally discharged during the wild skid into the shallows of Reese's cow pond. "Did Hazel shoot Dave?" Ruby asked. "Did she kill him with his own gun?" Ruby couldn't imagine where Hazel would have procured a pistol with a silencer, but with Dave's criminal history, it wouldn't have been surprising for him to own such a thing. "What you don't know can't hurt you," Fred said, "but the way you're driving could kill us both." There was never any mysterious backer for launching Sylvester and the gold nuggets into show business, was there? That money in the briefcase was just money you'd already extorted from Miss Potts, and now you're trying to figure out where she stashed the rest of the money she and Dave got from holding up that bank over in Saginaw? Fred let out a huff through his nose. Look, lady, he spat out. I was planning on letting you off somewhere, but you're too nosy. Even though over the hum of the engine Ruby could hear the click of Fred taking the pistol back off safety, Ruby refused to be cowed. It was unlikely, she decided, that Fred would take the time to shoot her and change drivers while they were still in the vicinity of Port Blanchet. It was only a matter of time before the police caught up with the bookmobile. There might very well be a shootout then, something Ruby would rather have avoided, but it was not likely that Fred was going to put a bullet in her head while they were speeding along the highway at 60 miles an hour. That money you were looking for, Ruby told Fred. It's not in the van anymore. Fred swore under his breath. I suppose you have the rest of it, though. Only a few thousand, Fred admitted. Hazel told me there was $20,000 hidden in the bookmobile, but she clammed up and stopped talking when I asked where the rest of it went. I suppose Dave had it. This Ruby doubted. Dave hadn't kept his hands on his fair share of it if Ruby's version of what had happened between Dave and Hazel was anywhere near the truth. Had Hazel somehow gotten wind that the money in the bookmobile had been seized by the police? For her to blithely tell Fred where the money was hidden would have been out of character, to say the least. It seemed far more likely that Hazel already knew the money was gone, and when Fred went looking for it and found out it was no longer there, Hazel planned to accuse him of taking it, therefore wriggling out of their ill-conceived bargain. Fred's confession scared Ruby a little. Had he made up his mind that it didn't matter what he told her because he was planning to finish her off and leave her body behind in a ditch somewhere? Or perhaps down old Mr. Howerton's root cellar? Dave burned the bands holding the money together in the barrel behind Eller's garage, Ruby said. It's a shame. Possibly no one will ever find where Dave hid that money. Fred swore under his breath. He must have hidden it pretty well, Ruby said, seeing as he'd rather die than tell Miss Potts what he'd done with it. You should know that the police are aware of Dave's involvement in the robbery, and they're looking for the money, too. Well, they aren't looking for me, said Fred. That wasn't exactly true. They were looking for Ruby and the bookmobile, and when they found that, they'd find Fred with it. My hands are clean, Fred insisted. If you didn't kill Hazel Potts, Ruby said, who did? I lied, said Fred as Ruby tapped the brakes in a show of navigating the curve. There was obviously a struggle in your room right before Miss Potts was shot, said Ruby. Did you fight over the gun? Did Miss Potts try to shoot you first? Ruby tapped the brakes abruptly just to make sure Fred didn't get any ideas about what she was up to. This thing is loaded, Fred squeaked as he clung to the back of the driver's seat to prevent himself from sliding across the floor of the van. So you'd better stop fooling around. It was a split second later that the wheels of the bookmobile left the pavement. The van lurched across the rutted mud adjoining the edge of the cow pond. Ruby didn't hear the pistol go off, but as the front wheels of the old library van sank into the mire as the engine raced, she heard a thud behind her. Ruby hadn't heard the shot because of the silencer on the pistol, but when she looked back, Fred lay on the floor of the van, clutching at his abdomen, a dark red stain soaking the front of his shirt. Whether Fred had been lying about the circumstances surrounding Hazel's death was still an open question, but it was abundantly clear that the pistol had been loaded, and somehow in the chaos of the accident, he'd managed to shoot himself in the stomach. Fred had dropped the gun and clutched at his midsection with both hands, so Ruby crawled back and retrieved the pistol from the floor before awkwardly hoisting herself out the back door and making a run for the Reese's farmhouse on the other side of the cow pond. When she reached the back porch of the farmhouse, she stashed the pistol under a snowball bush before yelling a hearty "hello" through the screen door into the kitchen. Mrs. Reese came to the back door, wiping her wet hands on her apron. "There's been an accident," Ruby said. "I've run the bookmobile into your cow pond." This was not strictly true. Ruby had driven the bookmobile into the cow pond on purpose. However, if she had to tell the whole story about how Fred Wiley had come to lay bleeding in the back of it, she'd never get to the telephone in time to summon George and his posse before the miscreant in question had a chance to crawl away. Instead of calling the police station, she asked Minnie for the library. When she got Martha, she asked if the police were on the premises. "What happened to you?" Martha demanded. "It's a long story," Ruby said. "I'll tell you later. But right now, run out and tell George to hurry out to the Reese's farm." "I would," said Martha, "but the police have come and gone. Alma Finch happened to see you leaving the parking lot at the wheel of the bookmobile, and when she told Chief Hobbs that, he took off like all the minions of Hades were on his heel." "How long ago was that?" "About 10 minutes. Ruby hung up and phoned the station. Sergeant Sprackling, who'd just arrived for his shift, promised to get through to Chief Hobbs on the radio. It was another 10 minutes before Ruby saw the squad car driven by George arrive. Another, with Joe at the wheel, arrived 15 minutes later. By the time Ruby made it out to the cow pond, George had taken Fred into custody, and Joe and another of the officers were loading Fred carefully into the back of one of the squad cars. "We'll take him to Doctor Wrigley's first," George was saying as Ruby came up behind them. "But I suppose he'll need to be taken on to the hospital in Saginaw." George turned, and when he saw his mother, he gave her a look that said, "I'll deal with you later." Chapter 17. Later turned out to be the following day, after Dr. Wrigley had patched up Fred Wiley sufficiently to make the trip to the hospital in Saginaw, where he'd remain under guard until he was well enough to be taken off to jail. Joe had been the one to take Ruby's detailed statement. George had made himself scarce, which Ruby took as a sign that her son was too angry with her to trust himself not to say something he would regret. 24 hours after Ruby had crashed the bookmobile into the Reese's cow pond, she and George sat in her cozy kitchen, each with a slice of apple pie and a mug of hot coffee. "We won't discuss how you came to be abducted at gunpoint," said George. "I refuse to lecture my own mother." "Then don't," Ruby told her son as she plunged her fork into the steaming slice of apple pie on the table. "Has Fred confessed yet?" Ruby asked after George had finished his first slice of pie and started on his second. "To abduction and theft of a motor vehicle, he hardly needed to. He was caught red-handed. I meant, has Fred confessed to killing Hazel Potts? He's claiming it was in self-defense, but I wouldn't have believed Miss Potts was capable of murdering anyone. Fred is claiming that Miss Potts had already murdered Dave McGee." "Do you believe him?" "I'm inclined to, but what happens to Fred Wiley now is up to a jury of his peers." "But you recovered that suit from Miss Potts's boarding house?" George nodded. "And you sniffed it?" Ruby asked. "Yes, you made that point quite clear in your report to Sergeant Sprackling. The strong presence of aftershave clinging to the suit does suggest that it was, at some point, if not actually worn by Fred Wiley, in contact with copious quantities of his aftershave. I believe that Fred caught Hazel trying to plant the suit in his room. A struggle ensued. She tried to shoot him. Fred got the gun out of her hand and killed her instead. Then, before fleeing the premises, he put the suit back in Hazel's bureau drawer where Sylvester eventually found it." "And Mr. Wiley didn't take into account that it would smell strongly of his aftershave?" "No, I expect that Fred Wiley's olfactory senses have become immune to that particular scent." "I suppose," said George. "We were able to find a witness who spotted Mr. Wiley going into the rooming house a few minutes before Sylvester arrived and found his aunt's body. Of course, it will be up to the judge and jury to consider that he may have killed her in self-defense, but there's little question in my mind that Fred Wiley was the one who killed Hazel Potts." "I feel the same," said Ruby. "Have another piece of pie." Hazel Potts was dressed by the undertaker in a blue suit Ruby had never seen before, and the mink stole, the purchase of which had probably initiated the entire tragic saga. Out of deference to Sylvester's feelings, although it was inevitable that word would get out once Fred Wiley went to trial, Ruby didn't breathe a word of Hazel's involvement in the holdup of the Saginaw Citizens National Bank. She certainly wasn't going to be the one to inform Sylvester that the woman who'd practically raised him, no matter how grudgingly, had very likely shot one of her boarders in the back and left him dead in the alley. George, Joe, and the other boys down at the station kept their mouths shut, and Fred Wiley certainly wasn't giving any implicating interviews from his cell in the jail over in Saginaw. The pallbearers were boys from Sylvester's band. They carried Miss Potts's casket down the aisle of the Methodist church, looking very downcast. To the uninformed congregant, the boys appeared to be lending an appropriate solemnity to the occasion. But Ruby knew better. The gold nuggets were despondent because their dreams of fame and fortune had evaporated with the arrest of Fred Wiley. As Ruby sat in her pew, she stole a glance over at Mayor Prill. He'd fallen asleep with his chin to his chest. Just as Reverend Murphy had moved on from waxing eloquent on the temporal nature of the earthly tabernacle of the body to waxing eloquent on the eternal nature of the everlasting soul, Julius Prill woke himself up with a loud snore. When Mayor Prill sheepishly glanced around to see if anyone had noticed, Ruby hastily transferred her attention to her gloved hands folded demurely in her lap. Each of us may receive what is due us for the things done while in the body, whether good or bad. Reverend Murphy concluded his reading. The Reverend, of course, had been referencing eternal justice. Occasionally, however, one got what was coming to one here on earth, and such had been the fate of Miss Hazel Potts. The end.